meter on my cab had been acting up that week, and every few fares I had to tap the plastic cover with my knuckle to get the display to stop flickering. I was parked near a row of shops in town waiting for another fare when a woman walked up to the passenger side and asked if I was available. I told her I was and unlocked the door. She got in carrying a small shoulder bag and gave me an address. The destination wasn't in town. It was few miles out in a rural area with scattered houses, wooded stretches, and roads I knew pretty well from years of driving. People requested rides out there fairly often. Some had family property out there, rented old farmhouses. There were plenty of reasons someone might need to go there. The woman looked to be somewhere in her 30s. I wasn't good at guessing ages even back then. She spoke clearly, seemed sober, and didn't appear nervous. She seemed unusually calm. She didn't make much small talk at first. We got out of town and onto the county roads. The woman had been looking out the window for most of the ride when she suddenly asked me how tall I was. The question caught me off guard. I laughed and told her. She nodded as if she were confirming something and went back to looking outside. A minute later, she asked how much I weigh. That was stranger. I remember smiling awkwardly and saying, "Close enough to not fit into my old clothes anymore." She just asked if I knew my exact weight. I gave her a rough answer. Then she asked if I exercised. I was wondering if she worked in healthcare or something. People ask strange questions sometimes. Driving a cab taught me that pretty quickly. I've had passengers tell me their entire life story during a 20-minute ride. I've had people ask my opinion on religion, politics, marriage, taxes, fishing, and one guy spent nearly an hour trying to convince me that everyone should raise pigeons. So, I answered politely and kept driving. The questions got stranger. She asked if I knew my blood type. I told her I didn't. She seemed disappointed by that answer. Then she asked if I'd ever donated blood. I said yes, years earlier. She asked whether I had any medical conditions. At that point, I remember glancing at her in the mirror. I was mostly trying to figure out if she was joking. She wasn't smiling. She was sitting upright, looking directly at me. I asked if she was a nurse or something. She shook her head. That was the end of the conversation for a few minutes. The road eventually narrowed as we got farther from town. There were fewer houses and longer stretches of woods. Back then, there weren't as many developments out there as there are now. Some sections felt isolated after dark. I remember seeing the headlights sweep across tree trunks every time the road curved. The woman eventually leaned forward and asked how much farther. I told her maybe 10 or 15 minutes. She said okay and settled back into her seat. Not long after that, she started giving me directions that differed from the address she'd originally provided. She wasn't changing the destination. It was like she wanted me to approach it from a different road. Sometimes people preferred certain routes. We turned onto a road that cut through a heavily wooded area. I knew it well enough but rarely used it at night because there wasn't much reason to. The road wasn't dangerous as far as I know. Very few houses. The woman became noticeably more attentive once we entered that area. She kept looking out both windows. She told me to slow down. I slowed. She pointed ahead and said she wanted me to stop near a break in the trees. I pulled over. The spot didn't look like an address to me. There wasn't a visible house. There wasn't a mailbox. There wasn't even a driveway that I could see from where I was sitting. Just woods. I asked if this was the right place. She said yes. Then she did something that confused me. She told me to wait there. Not in the sense of keeping the meter running for a few minutes while she grabbed something. It sounded more specific than that. She said, "Wait here, I'll be right back." I asked if she was sure. She said yes and got out. I watched her in the side mirror as she walked back the way we'd come. I could still see her shape because of the headlights, and because she was wearing a lighter colored top. She stopped near the edge of the trees. I thought she might be meeting someone, and I wondered if she was looking for a landmark. People sometimes forgot exact property lines or driveways in rural areas. I sat there with the engine running. A couple minutes passed. Then I looked back into the mirror and noticed I couldn't immediately see her. I leaned slightly to get a better angle. The trees blocked part of my view. I thought she'd stepped farther off the road, and I saw she was jogging back toward the cab. You know what? She was running as fast as she could. Even from that distance, something looked very wrong. The way she was moving seemed unsteady. Her arms were tight against her body. She stumbled once and almost fell. I remember opening my door because I thought she might be injured. Before I could even step out, she reached the cab. She yanked the rear door open and threw herself inside. And I saw the blood. Her shirt looked dark. The interior light caught it. There was blood all across the front of her clothing, far more than you'd expect from a cut on a hand or a scrape from falling. I stared at her. She stared back. I've never forgotten her face in that moment. She looked shocked, like whatever had happened had happened so fast she hadn't fully caught up to it yet. Then she yelled at me to go, drive. I put the car in gear and pulled away. The road behind us was empty. I couldn't see anyone. The woman had slumped against the seat. I asked what happened, asked if someone had attacked her. No answer. She was breathing heavily but barely responding. I noticed more blood. It was soaking through her clothing. Some of it had gotten onto the seat. I had a bleeding passenger in the back of my cab on an isolated road at night, and I had no idea what had happened to her. Back then, the company used a dispatch system that seems ancient compared to what exists now. I contacted dispatch and told them I had an injured passenger and was heading toward the nearest hospital. The dispatcher started asking questions. Every few seconds, I asked if she could hear me. She didn't react. I asked her who had hurt her. Nothing. I asked if there was someone still back there. Nothing. She seemed physically capable of speaking, at least for a little while. She just didn't. At one point, she opened her eyes and looked out the window. I asked again what happened. She turned toward me. I thought she was finally going to explain everything. She said something I still remember almost word for word. She said, "Just keep driving." Then she closed her eyes again. I drove the rest of the way to the hospital as fast as I safely could. The emergency entrance wasn't busy when I pulled up, which was the only lucky thing about that entire night. As soon as I stopped, a couple of staff members came out with a wheelchair. I got out and started trying to explain what little I knew. A woman had gotten into my cab, asked to go to a rural address, got out near the woods, came back covered in blood, and refused to explain what happened. That was basically the story. The staff immediately took over. They got her inside. While I stood there covered in questions I couldn't answer, they asked if I knew her name. I realized I didn't. Back then, most passengers paid cash. We didn't ask for identification. People got in, told us where they wanted to go, and that was that. Every question they asked sounded reasonable, and every answer I gave was some version of "I don't know." Not long afterward, law enforcement arrived. I expected that someone had obviously been seriously injured. The officers spoke with me while other people worked on the woman inside. It involved me repeating everything I'd already said. Where did I pick her up? What route did we take? Where exactly did she leave the vehicle? The only thing I knew for certain was that she walked away from the cab looking completely fine and returned a short time later bleeding heavily. The officers mentioned that she had made everything feel much darker. I ended up staying at the hospital for quite a while that night, answering questions and giving a statement. The details of all that are fuzzy now. It was decades ago, and most of it wasn't particularly dramatic. What I do remember is finally driving home long after I should have been asleep. This story sounds like somebody writing a fiction. There wasn't a huge amount visible in the back seat because emergency staff had tried to keep things contained while moving her. The next day, the company took the vehicle out of service. The woman survived. That was the main thing. The injuries had been serious but not fatal. Beyond that, details were limited. I wasn't family. I wasn't involved beyond being the driver, at least on the surface. My mind kept circling. Who was she meeting out there? Why had she asked me those strange questions during the drive? Why did she walk into the darkness by herself? And most importantly, who stopped her? Months passed, years. The woman never explained what happened, at least not in any way that reached me. She survived. She spoke to people. But whatever she told them apparently didn't lead to any simple answer. Or maybe she didn't tell them much. The point is that nobody ever contacted me to say, "Here's what happened that night." No suspect was ever discussed with me. No explanation was ever shared with me. The whole thing seemed to disappear into a fog of unanswered questions. She never publicly explained who attacked her. That was it. I remember feeling strangely unsettled because real life usually doesn't work that way. Sometimes I'd try to reconstruct it logically. She had arranged to meet someone. The meeting went wrong. She was robbed. It was someone she knew. She walked into something she wasn't expecting. The strange questions during the drive stayed with me. The questions about my height, my weight, my blood type, my health. Those questions stand out. It's like finding a puzzle piece that clearly belongs somewhere, but never discovering where. When I picture that night, it feels like she was out of the car for no time at all. A couple minutes. I didn't see anyone chasing her. I didn't hear another person. I didn't see a vehicle leave. I didn't even see movement among the trees. Nothing came close to matching the feeling of that night. I still consider it the scariest thing I've ever experienced. After all the questions and reports and conversations, I was left with essentially the same amount of information I'd started with. Almost none. Decades have gone by. The cab company I worked for doesn't even exist anymore. Most people involved have probably moved on with their lives. I never learned who attacked her, and I never learned what happened during those few minutes outside my cab. As far as I know, I got no answers. And considering how many years have passed, I doubt I ever will. I was sitting on the living room floor sorting a pile of old magazines when the phone rang. This was when everyone still had a landline. It was midnight. My roommate had been gone for a couple of days visiting family. I had the place to myself. We both had schedules that kept one of us away for a day or two. I never thought much about being alone. The neighborhood was good. The doors were locked, and I had lived there long enough that spending a night by myself didn't even register as something worth thinking about. I picked up the phone and said hello. A man on the other end, he sounded oddly calm. He asked was whether my roommate was home. It was strange that he didn't ask for her by name. He just asked if my roommate was there. I said, no, she wasn't home. Then he hung up. That was it. I was standing there for a moment holding the receiver because it felt a little rude. I figured it was someone she knew who didn't feel like talking to me. She had friends from work, cousins, people from school. It wasn't my business. The next morning I mentioned it to her during a phone call. She asked what the guy sounded like. I told her I didn't know how to answer that because he sounded like a normal man. She laughed and asked if he sounded old or young. I said somewhere in the middle. The following week went by. One evening, my roommate and I rented a couple of movies and stayed up late. We had both worked that day and were tired. I think we watched one movie completely and got halfway through another before deciding to go to bed. The last thing my roommate said before disappearing into her room was something about needing to get up early. I fell asleep quickly. At some point I woke up. I heard screaming. I thought I was dreaming because it didn't make sense. The scream was loud enough to wake me from a dead sleep. It sounded like my roommate from inside, specifically from her room. I jumped out of bed and ran into the hallway. I was calling her name while moving toward her bedroom. The screaming had stopped by then. I reached her doorway and looked inside. The room was empty. At least that was my first impression. The curtains were moving from the fan, but my roommate wasn't in the room. How I had heard what sounded like her screaming from inside the room, only to find nobody there. I stepped farther in and called her name again. Her bedside lamp had been knocked over. It was lying on the floor near the wall. I assumed she'd heard something and run outside or gone to a neighbor's apartment. I took another step toward the bed and someone grabbed me. The next second, a hand locked onto my arm with enough force that it hurt. The grip was unbelievably strong. I was yanked sideways. My shoulder slammed into something. I think it was the wall. It was like being caught by somebody much larger than you. I screamed and twisted. The person tried pulling me back toward them for whatever reason. Maybe because I panicked. Maybe because I moved unexpectedly. I managed to wrench my arm free. I stumbled forward and fell. The hallway was directly ahead of me. I ran. I wasn't trying to identify who had grabbed me. I wasn't trying to help my roommate. I was simply trying to get away from whatever had just put its hands on me. As I reached the hallway, I looked back. My mom always asked why I looked back. I don't know. I think most people would. You want to know what is chasing you? You want your brain to put a label on the thing that's trying to hurt you? What I saw is still one of the strangest images I've ever seen. The person standing in that room was a huge man. He was big, broad shoulders, thick arms, massive chest. The thing that made it so disturbing wasn't just his size. It was what he was wearing, or rather what he wasn't wearing. He had on a tiny pair of underwear that looked ridiculous on someone his size, and a mask covering his face. My brain was trying to survive. I only saw him for a second or two before turning away again. I ran toward the front door. While I was running, I heard another scream from outside. This time, I instantly recognized my roommate's voice. The front door was already open when I reached it. I ran out into the night barefoot. I spotted my roommate farther down the sidewalk. She was standing near the curb looking back toward the apartment. The second she saw me, she started running toward me. Neither of us was making much sense. She grabbed my shoulders and told me she'd seen a man in the apartment. She described someone grabbing at her in her room. She'd managed to get away and run outside. The reason she had stopped running was because she knew I was still inside. She said she'd been trying to decide whether to go back into the apartment or start pounding on neighbors' doors when she saw me come out. We ended up going to a nearby house, and the owners let us use their phone. Police arrived. I was trying to figure out how long he had been there, and that was where my mind eventually returned to the phone call. The phone call had happened about a week before. I don't know why that connection didn't immediately occur to me while we were standing outside. Maybe because we were too busy trying to understand how a stranger had somehow gotten inside our apartment. Because my mind was focused on the fact that a giant masked man had just chased both of us out of our own home. Was it somebody she knew, Or was he trying to figure out who was in the apartment that night? I brought it up to my roommate more than once. She never had an explanation for it. Neither of us recognized the voice. Neither of us could think of a reason somebody would call after midnight just to ask whether she was home. Years later, I still can't think of one. What made everything even stranger was that neither of us could figure out where the man had come from. The apartment wasn't large. It wasn't some huge house with a basement and hidden rooms. There were only so many places somebody could hide. The bedroom where I encountered him wasn't cluttered. My roommate kept things relatively neat. There wasn't enough space for a man that size to disappear behind furniture. I wondered if he had been standing somewhere inside that room the entire time. And I simply failed to notice him because my attention was focused on finding my roommate. He wasn't a small person. He was enormous. The image I remember, it's the size difference. I wasn't a particularly large woman, and seeing somebody that much bigger than me at arm's length created a kind of fear I had never experienced before. You hear people talk about fight or flight responses, but until that night, I never understood how automatic they really are. Every part of my body just decided to run. For years, I had occasional nightmares involving that hallway. My roommate, she focused on what she heard. She told me she woke up because she thought someone was in her room, breathing. She said it sounded like somebody standing nearby trying to breathe. When she opened her eyes, she initially couldn't tell what she was looking at because the room was dark. She thought there was a pile of clothes near the wall. The man lunged toward her and she managed to get away. That was her version. My version started few seconds later when I heard those screams. The two stories lined up disturbingly well. It only confirmed that we had both encountered the same person. Why he was there? Nothing stolen. There was no motive. There wasn't even an obvious point where he could have entered the apartment without being noticed. The experience had changed something in my brain. Home had always felt like the place where bad things weren't supposed to happen. But I understood that walls and locked doors don't guarantee anything. My roommate moved away. Life moved on. Who was he? How did he get inside? As the years passed, details became harder to separate from memory itself. That's another reason I don't claim to know what happened. People tend to become more certain about stories over time, but I've become less certain. I know I received a phone call. My boyfriend and I had already signed paperwork for another place nearby, but there was a gap between when we had to leave our old rental and when we could fully move into the new one. The solution seemed simple at the time. We rented this old house for 2 weeks. It wasn't meant to be permanent. Most of our important stuff was already packed in boxes, and every day felt like we were halfway between one place and another. It was just old in a way that made every room feel a little neglected. Some houses feel welcoming, even when they're outdated. This one never did. The floors weren't level, and there were stains on some of the walls that looked older than both of us. The place looked like something from one of the home renovation shows where the hosts walk through and start pointing out everything wrong with it. The kitchen cabinets were painted at some point, but the paint was chipping. There was a basement that neither of us really used except for storage. The light down there worked, but it was dim. My boyfriend was staying there with me most of the time because he was dealing with some family-related issues nearby and needed somewhere temporary to stay between everything that was going on. I don't think either of us liked the house much, but it was only for 2 weeks, so we kept telling ourselves it didn't matter. That afternoon, we spent most of the day moving smaller items into the new house. By evening, we were exhausted. I was eating takeout in the kitchen because most of our dishes were already packed away. Later that night, my boyfriend got a call and ended up needing to go to his family's house, unexpectedly. I won't get into the reason because it wasn't really my situation to share, but it was serious enough that he couldn't put it off until morning. I asked if he thought he'd be back that night. He said he wasn't sure. Probably late, he said, or maybe tomorrow morning. I was standing near the front door while he grabbed his keys. "You'll be okay here?" I laughed and said, "It's one night." After he left, I locked the door behind him and settled into the living room with my phone. It was just a quiet night. The living room was connected to the kitchen by a hallway-like opening. From where I sat, I could see the kitchen table and the chairs. I spent the next hour doing nothing interesting, texting a friend, looking at furniture listings for the new place. Eventually, I got hungry and decided to get something from the kitchen. I remember standing up from the chair I had been sitting in and walking into the kitchen to grab a drink. The entire trip couldn't have taken more than a minute. I opened the refrigerator, looked around, poured myself something, and turned around. When I came back toward the living room, I stopped. Something looked different. The chair I had been sitting in wasn't where I left it. It had moved. The chair was few feet away from where it had originally been. I walked over and looked. I thought one of the legs had gotten caught on something and shifted when I stood up. There wasn't anything there. The chair had been near the coffee table when I got up. Now it was sitting farther toward the hallway opening. I tested it by pulling it across the floor. It made a loud scraping noise, the kind of noise that definitely would have gotten my attention. I must have been distracted and accidentally moved it without noticing. It didn't really make sense. I hadn't moved it. I knew where it had been. I had been sitting in it for over an hour. After staring at it for a minute, I pushed it back where it belonged and sat down again. I texted my boyfriend about it as a joke. Either I'm losing my mind or your haunted house is rearranging furniture. He responded a few minutes later with a laughing emoji. 25 minutes later, I heard water running in the kitchen, running water like someone had turned on the faucet. I got up and walked into the kitchen. The sink was off. Everything was dry. I remember looking directly into the sink because I was expecting to see water flowing. There wasn't anything. I could still hear the sound. The moment I noticed that, I got a very uncomfortable feeling. The sound wasn't coming from the sink. It sounded like it was coming from somewhere behind me. I turned around. The noise seemed to be coming from the living room. I wondered if a video on my phone had started playing in the background. I checked. Nothing. The house had old plumbing, so I started thinking there was a pipe in the wall somewhere. Maybe I was hearing something through the structure. The sound seemed to move. When I took a few steps toward the living room, it sounded farther away, like I was approaching the place where it should be coming from, but it kept shifting. I don't know how to explain. I slowly walked back into the living room. Nothing had moved. The sound continued and then stopped. I called my boyfriend. He didn't answer. A few minutes later, he texted saying he couldn't talk at the moment. How do you explain this? I ended up making some tea because doing something felt better than standing there overthinking every sound in the house. During the previous week, I had heard all kinds of random noises at night. The difference was that those noises usually made sense. Around midnight, I decided to go upstairs and try to sleep. I took my tea with me and walked toward the staircase. The basement door was near the bottom of the stairs. It was one of those older wooden doors with several layers of paint on it. I passed it every day without thinking about it. As I reached the stairs, I heard something from the direction of the basement. It didn't sound mechanical. Sounded human, like somebody groaning. After a few seconds, same thing happened slightly longer. The house was old enough that anything seemed possible. What I didn't want to do was open that door and go investigate by myself at midnight. So I didn't. I headed upstairs instead, moving faster. I got to the bedroom, set my mug down, and started getting ready for bed. Few minutes later, I realized I had left my phone charger downstairs. The last thing I wanted was to go back down there. I made it halfway down before hearing that same sound again somewhere below me. Waited a few seconds before continuing down. I grabbed the charger from the living room and started heading back upstairs. I had my charger in one hand and was walking back toward the stairs. I was looking toward the hallway that led to the kitchen because I thought I heard something shift in that direction. I took another step. What happened next is difficult to explain because it wasn't like fainting the way people describe it. The first thing was my vision. The color disappeared. I mean, everything looked black and white. I thought I was having some kind of medical issue. I remember blinking few times because I thought something was wrong with my eyes. All the color was gone. At the exact same time, I became aware of somebody standing beside me. It was like knowing somebody was there. The presence seemed to be on my left side. I remember beginning to turn my head. Before I could fully look, I felt something touched my hip. The left side of my hip. It felt like somebody standing next to me had reached out and placed a hand there. That's the last thing I remember. The next memory is waking up on the floor. I didn't even know I had been unconscious. I opened my eyes and thought I had somehow fallen asleep. Then I saw the room. I was lying on the floor near the same area where I had been standing. My charger was a few feet away. My neck hurt. One side of my shoulder hurt. The lamp in the living room was still on. Color had returned. I sat up slowly because I felt disoriented. I checked my phone. Almost an hour had passed. I thought the phone was wrong. I checked it multiple times. The time didn't change. I had somehow lost close to an hour. I must have fainted, but I had never fainted before. I wasn't sick. I hadn't been drinking. The weird black and white vision and the sensation of someone touching me happened immediately before everything went blank. I got up and checked myself for injuries. Other than feeling sore, I seemed okay. I went into the bathroom and looked in the mirror because I wanted to make sure I hadn't hit my face on something. Nothing looked wrong. I was scared, so I called my boyfriend repeatedly until he answered, grabbed my keys, my phone, and my purse. Eventually, he met me. The next day, he convinced me to get checked out. Nothing came from it. A few possibilities were suggested, but nothing good. People have suggested countless explanations since then. If I completely remove the blackout from the story, there are still things I can't explain. The chair, the running water sound, the noises from the basement. I was there. I know what I experienced. Thankfully, we only had a few days left before moving into the new place. We finished moving and left. Nothing remotely similar has ever happened again. I've never experienced the black and white vision. Never lost another hour. An hour of my life simply disappeared. No matter how I rearrange it, there's always a point where the explanation stops and the questions start. It felt real and I don't know what actually happened.